Hello and welcome to the last lecture of this Services and Dependency Injection section. In this lecture, we are going to learn how we can communicate between two components using services. Component interaction with services is super easy. So let's see what we are going to implement in this lecture. In this lecture, we are going to create two components. The first component will be all user component and the second component will be user detail component. And these two components are completely unrelated. Okay, so these two components does not have a parent-child relationship. Now, what we want is when a user clicks on this show detail button of this all user component, we want to display the complete detail of that user in the user detail component. In the same way, if the user clicks on the second show detail button, in that case, the detail of this user should be displayed in the user detail component. So basically, here when the button click event will happen in this all user component, we want to send some data to this user detail component and we want to display that data in that component. Let's see how we can do that. So here I have created a brand new Angular project with the name user detail service. And currently in the app component.html file, I have added one div with this class container. And in the CSS file of this app component, I have written some CSS. Okay, now let's first go ahead and let's create a folder inside this app folder. And let's call this folder services. Inside this services folder, we are going to keep all our services. And inside this services folder, let's create a new file. Let's call it user service. Inside this, let's go ahead and let's create a class. Let's call it user service. And let's also export this class. Now inside this class, let's go ahead and let's create a property called users. And this property is going to store an array of users. Okay. And in order to save some time, I have already created some users. So let's grab it from here and let's use it inside this users array. Okay. So each user here has a name property, this job property, gender, country, age, and avatar. So this avatar is nothing but an image file path. All right. Now let's go ahead and let's inject this user service inside this app component. For that, let's create a constructor for this app component class. Inside this constructor, let's specify a private parameter and let's call it user service. And it is going to be of type user service. And in order to use this user service class, we also need to import it. And let's also specify the providers for this service. So it is going to be user service. All right, so all these things you already know from our previous lectures. So here we have provided and injected this user service inside this app component. And the same instance will also get injected in the child components of this app component, right? Now, the next thing which we are going to do is we are going to create all users components. So for that, let's open VS Code built-in terminal. And here let's use ng generate command. And here we want to generate a component. And let's call this component all users. Okay, so this all users component has been created. Let's go to its HTML file. And here, let's add some HTML. And again, in order to save some time, I have already written that HTML. So let's grab it from here. And let's paste it inside this all users component.html file. Okay, and I have also written some CSS. So let's also grab that CSS from here. Let's go to VS Code and let's use it inside this CSS file. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's close this CSS file. Now, what we want is inside this all users component.html, we want to display all the users which we have inside this user service. And for that, inside this, all user component class, let's go ahead and let's create a new property. Let's call it users. Okay. And to this users property, we want to assign this users property of this user service class. Okay. So let me copy this one object from here, because here I want to specify the, you know, type of this users property. So this users property is going to be an object, and this object will have a name property which is going to be of type string. So let's specify that. In the same way, it is going to have a job property which is again going to be of type string. Same is the case with gender. It is also going to be of type string. Then this country is also going to be of type string. This age is going to be of type number, and avatar is again going to be of type string. Okay, so here we are creating this users property which is going to be of type object with these properties, and this users is going to be an array of these type of objects. So we also need to use square bracket like this, and initially let's set it to an empty array. Now what we want is, to this users property we want to assign the array which is stored in the users property of this user service. So first we need an instance of this user service inside this all users component class. So again, in the constructor, let's specify a private parameter. Let's call it user service, which is going to be of type user service. And since we are already providing this user service on this app component, the same instance will also get passed to this all user component, because we are going to use this component as the child component of this app component. In fact, let's first do that. So inside this div, let's add another div. Inside this div, let's first add an h3 element, and here let's say all users. And then let's use the selector of this all user component. So let's copy this selector and let's use it here. So now this all user component is a child component of this app component, right? So this instance, an instance of this user service will be injected inside this app component, and the same instance will also get injected inside this all user component, because here we are providing this service on the app component level. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's access this user property of this user service class, and let's do that inside this ng on init. So here let's say this dot users. So the users property of this all users component, we want to set it to this dot user service dot users. Okay, so here we are assigning this array to this users property. Now let's go to all user component.html, and on this div let's use ng for. Okay, and let's loop over that users array. So here let's say let user of users, and actually let's copy the name of the property here in order to avoid any error. Okay, so we are looping over this users array, and for each iteration we want to display the user name and his occupation. So here let's use string interpolation, and let's use this user object user dot name, and in the same way let's use the job property of the user object. So user dot job. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page, and here you can see all the 4 users from the users array has been displayed here, and we also have these details button. So now what we want is whenever we click on this details button, we want to display the complete detail of this user. Okay, so for that, let's go ahead and let's create another component. And let's call this component user detail. So let's use ng generate command. We want to generate a component and let's call this component user detail. So this component has been created. Let's expand this. Let's open the HTML file first. And again, in order to save some time, I have already written that HTML. So let's grab this HTML from here and let's use it inside this user details component.html file. And also I have written some CSS. So let's open user detail component.css file and let's grab this CSS and let's paste it here. Okay, let's close this CSS file. All right. Now what we want is inside this all users. So inside this all users component, we have this button. And whenever this button is clicked for a particular user, we want to send the details of that user to this user detail component. Okay, so on this button element, let's first bind click event. Okay, so whenever this button is clicked, let's say we want to call a method from the all user component class. Let's call this method show details. Okay, and to this show details method, let's also pass that object. So we are receiving the object for each iteration inside this user variable. So let's pass that variable to this show detail method. Okay, now let's go to all user component class. And here let's create that show details method. Here let's specify the parameter name. Let's call it user. And again, this user is going to have, it is going to store an object. And that object is going to have these properties. So again, let's specify its type like this. All right. Now, what do we want to do inside this method? Well, let's first go to user service. And here, let's create an event. So first, let's create a property. Let's call it on show details clicked. Okay. And it is going to be an event. And we have learned that to create an event, we use event emitter class. Right. And in order to use this event emitter, we also need to import it from Angular Core. So let's do that. So import event emitter from Angular Core. Now this event emitter is going to emit a data of type object, and that object is going to have these properties. So let's specify this object here inside these brackets. Okay, and after that, let's use a set of parentheses. Okay, so here we have created a new event called on show details clicked. Now let's go ahead and let's create a method which will raise this event. Let's call this method show user details. Okay, and from this method, let's say we are going to receive a user object, and again it is going to be of type this object. And from within this method, let's raise this event. So let's say this dot on show details clicked dot emit. Okay, and what do we want to emit? We want to emit this user object. Let's copy this. Let's emit it from here. All right, now I know this might be a bit confusing. So let me recap what we have done so far. Inside this user services class, we have created a property called users, which is of type array and it is containing a list of users. Then we have created this event and we are raising this event from within this show user details method. Now we are going to call this show user details method from our all user component. Okay, so let's go to this all user component.ts file, and from within this show details, let's call this method. So let's say this dot user service dot show user details. Okay, and let's pass this user object to this show user details. Okay, so whenever this button will be clicked, this method will be called, this show details method will be called. And from within this show details method, we are calling this show user details. So this show user details method will be called. And when this method will be called, it will raise an event, this on show details clicked event. And when that event will be raised, it will emit this data, the data which we have inside this user parameter. And this parameter is basically going to store a user object. Okay, so from here we are emitting some data. Now let's go to user details component class. So let's open user details component class here. And first let's ask Angular to inject an instance of this user service. For that, let's create a private parameter. Let's call it user service. And again, it is going to be of type user service. Then here, let's create a property. Let's call this property user. And again, let's specify its type. So I'm going to copy this object from here. And let's specify its type. Let me close this user service. Okay, and this is not going to be an array. This user is going to store a single user object. Okay, now from this service, we are emitting some data when this on show details click method, this event is raised. In the user details component, let's catch that data. For that, inside this ng on init method, let's first access that event. So let's say this dot user service dot, and the event name is on show details clicked. And here, let's subscribe to that event. So basically, this event will emit an observable. Now we have not talked about observable yet, but we are going to talk about it from our next lecture. Okay, so this event is going to return an observable and we can subscribe to that observable. And to this observable, we can pass callback function. So here, this callback function is going to receive the data which the event has emitted. And the type of that data is again going to be this type. So let's specify that. Okay, and let's use arrow function here. And inside this, we simply want to set this user property with the user data which this service has emitted. Okay, it is also emitting a user data, right? So we want to set this dot user to this data. Okay, so whatever data this event has emitted, that will be stored inside this data parameter. So we are assigning that user to this user property. In this way, we have that user for which we have clicked the show details button inside this user property. Now let's go ahead and let's display the details of that user. So let's go to user details component, and here let's use that user property. So here let's say user dot name. In the same way, let's use other properties. So here let's say user dot job, because we want to display the occupation here. Then this user also has this country property. Then it also has this gender property. Okay, and it also has this age property. All right, and for this image source, let's use user dot avatar. And we also want to display this div only when this user object is not set to undefined. For that, let's use ngIf here. And here let's specify a condition that if user is not equal to undefined. Okay, with this, let's save the changes. Let's go to app component.html. But before that, let's copy the selector of this user detail component. Okay, now let's go to app component.html. Let's add another div here. And inside this div, let's use this selector. Okay, let's go to the web page. So let's click on this first user. So let's click on this details button. So when I click on this details button, you can see the details of that user has been displayed here. If I click on the details button of the second user, then his details are being displayed here. In the same way, if I click on the details button of the third user, his details or her detail will be displayed here. So our application is working as expected. And now we are communicating between two different components which are not related in any way using services. Okay, so here we are communicating between this all user component and user details component using services. Now I know that this lecture might be a bit confusing for you. So I will request you to go through this lecture 2 or 3 times and then everything will become more clear. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.